Welcome to the Leadership Conversations podcast. I'm your host, Jono White. I'm the founder and principal consultant of Clarity. We are an Australian-based consultancy that works with leaders around the world, and our passion is to invest in people to become everything they're meant to be in order to fill the world with healthy organizations that people love to work for and customers line up to buy from. The goal of this podcast is to invest in you and your leadership. If you're just joining us for the first time, then feel free to check out consultclarity.org. That's our website, consultclarity.org. We have so many free resources on there, the most popular being our 7 Questions on Leadership series. We've had more than 1,500 leaders from around the world in all different sectors give their in-depth answers on leadership, what books they love, what they found most challenging, the most meaningful stories, how they structure their time through the day. That's free, so go and check it out. And we'd love to interview you about your leadership. I believe you have advice from your experience, your context, and your life so far that is important and can help other leaders. It's also a great way to give back. It's free to get involved, and you can do so by going to consultclarity.org/7-questions-interest, or just Google consultclarity.org 7 questions interest and fill out the form that pops up. We have a free resource for you on our website. It's called Leadership Survival Guide. It's a 57-page ebook. It has interviews with 10 world-class leaders, and you can go to consultclarity.org. It's right at the top, and get that today. We also have a daily email that we send out to over 15,000 leaders, and that email contains the highlights, our best content from our podcasts, our blog, my book, the books that we're loving that are out there about leadership. It's also the best way to get access to our masterclasses and workshops before anyone else. And there's also exclusive and limited special options just for subscribers. And you can subscribe by going to consultclarity.org/subscribe. Now, my gift to you is to work incredibly hard to provide the best leadership content I can to invest in you and your leadership. So if you're finding our content helpful, if you find this podcast helpful, then your gift to me could be this. If you do find it helpful, then write a review or rate our content and make sure you subscribe or follow. I can't emphasize enough how helpful that is. It really does help us to get the word out there so we can invest in more leaders to become everything they're meant to be. It also means a lot to me personally when people like you and people in our community share our content on social media. So if you do that, then please do look for me, Jono White, to tag me, and look to tag Clarity on whatever platform you're on. And our team, including me, I'm always looking to see when people have mentioned us so that I can engage with you. And also we look at sharing content. So if you write something about something we've done, there's also a good chance we'll share that with our followers. So if you could do that, that is a massive, massive help as we try to invest in as many leaders as we can around the world. Last of all, you can check out my book about how to deal with difficult people even if you hate conflict. It's called Step Up or Step Out. It's available on Amazon. You can just look up Step Up or Step Out Jono White, or you can go to store.consultclarity.org/book and check it out there. I have coached leader after leader after leader, and in more than 50% of the sessions, this topic comes up. How do I deal with this person? I'm finding it really difficult, and I just want to find a way that doesn't blow up, to just to have a difficult conversation, to lead them better. How do I do that? There's a 3-step process that I outline in this book that I believe can help you. Okay, let's get into today's episode of the Leadership Conversations podcast. Enjoy. Welcome to another episode of the Leadership Conversations podcast. Today's guest is Chris Do. Chris is the founder and CEO of The Futur. Welcome to the podcast, Chris.
Thanks for having me, Jono.
Yeah, I've been looking forward to chatting with you. First of all, for our listeners, some people, a lot of people know what you do. You're quite well known, but there may be those who don't. Fill us in on the various hats you wear and what you're doing at the moment, Chris.
Sure. My current role right now is mostly just making content for the various platforms that we create content for, mostly YouTube, Instagram, LinkedIn, Twitter, and TikTok. And aside from doing that, I also author courses and run a coaching group called the Future Pro.
Awesome. Well, let's jump straight into it. I'd love to hear some of your story, Chris. Let's start with your childhood growing up. What were some of the moments from that season of your life that really shaped you into the person and the leader you are today?
Mm. Well, the first and probably most profound thing that impacted my life was in April 30th, 1975. It was the fall of Saigon. My parents, along with my uncles and aunts, fled Vietnam, and we escaped communism and wound up in America. I landed in, or we landed in Kansas City, Missouri in 1975. And so for me as a 3-year-old child, I didn't really have a sense of who we were, where we came from, but I knew something was different because we didn't look or sound like anybody else while growing up. And it was a hard thing to adjust to because my parents didn't speak a lot of English. My dad's first job in America was bussing tables at a bar, and that's what he wound up doing. Now, luckily, we came to America in a time in which you didn't need a degree to get a decent job. And my dad wound up doing a lot of night classes, and he was able to eventually wind up in San Jose, California, as a chief engineer at a semiconductor company. And the reason why I point that out is because we moved a lot. Every time we would be able to save up some money, my dad would move us from one lower income neighborhood to one level up, and we just kept doing that. So it meant that I was seeing many different cultures and societies from being lower income class to upper middle class.
Yeah, that must have been interesting. And I I think when someone has such an incredible story like you do, Chris, and your family, of coming out of just I can't even imagine your parents what must what that must have been like to make that journey to leave their home country and come to the US and start a new life. What did you learn from them as you watched them go through? Like, that's got to be one of the toughest things in life you can do, is to move countries. What did you learn from them, from your parents, that stuck with you as a leader, as an entrepreneur today?
Mm. I think some things were learned as lessons, and some things you just kind of learn through observation. You don't even know them until you look back later on. But I think my parents, having had to leave everything, quite literally everything behind, and losing their own country, I think there's a sense of detachment that we inherited as kids, my brothers and I. So we never became too attached to anything, and that was also amplified by the fact that we moved neighborhoods quite often. I went back and kind of retraced our steps a little bit, and on average, we moved about every year and a half to 2 years. And so, as a kid, I didn't know this, but I had a hard time making connections with friends, putting my roots down, and so I didn't really have a place or neighborhood to call home. And that's a stark contrast to my kids who have primarily grew up in one house in one neighborhood, who still have relationships with their childhood friends, whereas I hardly know anybody. And I think you could
Mm,
look at that like, that must have been really rough, but it also gave me the sense like I'm not bound by where I live or the things that I have. And so
yeah.
there's an incredible amount of freedom to that.
It's been one of the biggest surprises doing this podcast how often that specifically comes up. People talk about, when I ask them about their leadership and about, inevitably we end up talking about growing in resilience, and they talk about moving a lot when they were younger, and how that sort of shaped, for a lot of people as well, saying when you're moving that often. I don't know if you were moving neighborhoods as well as houses, but people who moved around to different locations had to learn how to make friends quickly, how to break into a group that they didn't know. That if you grow up in one place, you don't have that challenge. And I never would have picked that, but that's honestly been one of the most common themes from chatting with more than 150 leaders on this podcast.
Yeah, that would be surprising. So sometimes it was homes and sometimes it was neighborhoods, like switching school
Mm,
districts because one was more advantageous for us, even though the house was still the same. But
Sure.
unlike many of your guests, I didn't acquire those social skills. I didn't figure out how to reacclimate or acclimate to a new environment. And so I
Mm,
wanted being a bit of a loner, being more
yeah.
introspective. And I'm an introvert by nature, but I also think I developed some sense of just being very, very shy, like extreme shyness. I wouldn't make eye
Yes.
contact with people. People in high school, I remember, would try to say hello to me, and I just didn't know how to respond. It's not
Hmm.
that I didn't like people. I do like people, but I'm just so uncomfortable and so self-conscious that it became a really difficult thing for me.
You're now creating content, like you said, like one of the main things you do. That's a real contrast to growing up with
It
extreme
is.
shyness. How have like what has been the journey to go from extreme shyness to being, I guess, to doing what you're doing now?
Yes, and I just want to point something out. I started my company in 1995, and in 2007, I was having a holiday party for my staff of about 18 people. And I remember just being nervous as heck, just trying to write down a few words on a note card to thank people and to congratulate everyone for a job well done. It was a very festive time for us. This is just right before the economic meltdown of 2008. And I remember my executive producer, his name is Santino. He looked at me, he's like, Chris, you got to be kidding me. Just say something from your heart. But even in my own company, at a very joyous moment, I found it just like really difficult to speak, and I dismissed them. I said, you know what, I got to do it my way. So it's been a very difficult journey for me. But there was one moment in particular that things started to change. I remember my business coach at that time. His name is Kier McLaren, and he noticed something because clients were coming in and out of the office all the time. And whenever we would meet, he's like, Chris, I noticed that you're almost always secluded in your office. It's kind of really important for you to go and talk to the clients because that's who they develop relationships with. And as great as your team is, they won't always be here. And when they're gone, your clients will follow them because they don't even know who you are. And he also said something else. He said that you underestimate the power of being an owner. It means the world to clients and customers when the owner takes time out of their day just to come in and check in with them. And I told him, I'm like, here, the problem is I don't know how to enter those rooms and I don't know how to get out of them, quite literally. Like, I don't know how to just barge in there and
Hmm.
like say what. And so he called my staff together. He said, hey, everybody come together. He said, here's the thing. It's very important for the success of this company and your future employment here for Chris to get to know the clients. What I want you to do is I want you to introduce him and I want you to make up an excuse as to why he has to leave, get him in and out of the meetings. And so that's what quite literally happened. Clients would be there. My executive producer would introduce me and say, "Hey, everybody, Chris is on 3 other projects, but he wanted to come in and say hi to you." And I would say, "Hi, everybody, how's it going?" I could say that, and then they would just make up a random reason. There was no meeting. He's like, "Okay, I have to steal him for a bit. We're gonna get him out of here, right?"
Yeah.
And so it was kind of like social training wheels. And I would do that a couple of times. And
Yeah.
then I remember one time in particular, my executive producer, his name is David. David would say, "Hey, I got to get you out of here. We got," and I said, "You know, David, I'll be there. It can wait. It's okay. I'm prepared for that meeting." And he looked at me like, "Huh?" And I stayed there and I talked to the clients. And then eventually I said, I have to run. I'm probably slowing down the whole creative process for all of you, but just let me know if you need anything because we do care about your business. And so that was the beginning of my journey towards figuring out, like, I need to, I'm holding back my company. I'm holding back the opportunities that we could generate because
Yeah.
I am, as my business coach would say, the best salesperson for what it is that we do. Yet I'm
Mm,
deferring to others to do that, and they're going to do okay.
yeah. That's so good. I That really resonates with me because I have, I've talked in the podcast a lot about my journey with anxiety, and I remember one time sitting down with a psychologist and doing a test around social anxiety, which people who know me would find hilarious because once again, what do I do? I do a podcast. What did I do growing up? A lot of public speaking. But I always found that I would churn over in my head again and again whether I made any social errors or um and so I what I appreciate about your story is the intentionality, and it reminds me of something which only in the past couple of years has really helped me. I always find social settings when you meet someone out socially and like making small talk has always been a bit of a like a for me. It's never quite sat right with me because you ask someone, oh, so tell me, what do you do? And they say, oh, I've actually just recently been unemployed, and you think, oh man, I just put my foot in my mouth so badly. I don't want to make
Right.
someone new that I've just met feel like that. And I remember I came across this book, and I can't remember which book it is now off the top of my head, but it had this question in it, and the question was, when you're in a social setting, ask people, how do you spend most of your time? And it opens up this conversation where they can pick and choose. They can talk about their family, they can talk about work, they can talk about study. It often zooms in on what they're passionate about, and they can sort of pick from their perspective. And that's been such a game changer because it gave me a strategy. Anytime I meet someone in a social setting, rather than saying, "What do you do?" or I like to just start by saying, "Oh, so tell me, how do you spend most of your time?" And it's a similar intentionality that to your story, but in a social setting. And I think the great thing about both of those stories is that these sort of things can be learned.
Yeah, the funny thing is, I describe myself to people now as a loud introvert. And it's because people have this question, because it's like this strange dichotomy that creates a schism in their mind. Like, how can I say I'm this really socially awkward person, I have social anxiety, yet everywhere they turn on social media or on the stage, they're like, there I am. And so I kind of had to make up this term or this pairing of words called the loud introvert to explain why. Now, my goal in life is to make content so good, I actually don't have to have social skills. And allow me to explain. Because if you are really well known before you walk into a room and people get value from what it is that you're doing, then they're going to introduce themselves to you and say, "Hey, I love this video," or "I just saw you," or "How do I know you?" or "I think I've seen you before." And it's a great conversation starter. So it's much, much easier.
That's genius. I love that. That's such a great strategy. So interested to know, in your leadership journey, what was one of the first leadership opportunities you had, out of school or college? What was that journey like for you, Chris, where you had your first leadership opportunities? Do you remember?
Yeah, I do. There's a couple of opportunities that popped up, or a couple of memories that pop up in my mind. When I was still in school, I had this opportunity to work at an ad agency, and I decided to take a break from school before graduating. And I worked at this agency in Seattle called Cole and Weber. And there, as the most junior person, your title is art director if you deal with the visual aspects of an ad. And it was quite interesting because I would work really hard because this is just the training, the rigor that I got from going to art center. And my boss, Kevin Jones, he recognized that right away, and he would put me on new business pitches and get me really involved. He saw something in me that I didn't see in myself at that time. So even though I was only, I can't even say a year out of school because I'm still in school technically, he would fly me to client presentations because he knew I could speak to certain things and cared about the design and the way that the ads looked, that nobody else had that amount of passion for. And so I'm already getting tested out of school. And shortly thereafter, I graduate school. I stop working at the agency, and I'm freelancing around Los Angeles when my uncle calls me out of the blue and he says, ever since I've known you as a kid, you've always talked about wanting to own a business and you've always been hustling. How would you like to start a business? I'm like, of course. He goes, well, my business partner and I, who's a hotel developer, by the way, we want to invest in a design company. If this is something you're interested in doing, write a business plan and meet us for dinner because we're going to be in Los Angeles in like a week. So this is kind of like the dawn of the internet. It's not like you can just go online and say business plan. Made a few phone calls, just scrambled, worked all day, night for days. And I wind up meeting them at the Westin Bonaventure, which is a famous hotel here in Los Angeles. This scene for the backdrop for many movies. And I meet them. I hand over my business plan as a 22-year-old kid just straight out of school. They glance at it and they're like, well, here's a check. It's a good faith check. Let's do business together. And so there I am, not even a year out of school. I basically stop freelancing and start my own company. And so I've always looked for those kinds of opportunities.
Did you? That's so. I mean, that's incredible. Both of those stories. What's interesting is that both of those people made the call. They said, "Hey, we'd like you to fly over here. Hey, we'd like you to, we want to invest money in a business. Have you thought about doing this?" What do you think it was about you as such a young guy that built that trust or led to that? Do you know what I mean? Like that's
Hmm.
an abnormal thing for those for the average person to be seeing in a 20-year-old. What was it about you and how you did what you did, do you think?
I think it's a couple of things, and I don't want to get too woo woo on you because I'm not really a woo woo person myself. But I think there is this thing about the law of attraction when you put something out to the universe. The people and opportunities kind of gather around you to make those things happen. And as a young person, I think what I did was I showed that I want to start a business, and I would create one failed business after another. So the people who were paying attention, like my mom and my uncle and my friends, was like, he's going to be a business person. He's going to be an entrepreneur. And I didn't even know that term back then. I knew I wanted to create something. I wanted to be that kind of master of my own destiny, to author it. And so they could see that, they could see the determination, the focus, and probably coupled with the work ethic. Like, very specifically, my first boss, Kevin Jones, said, "You work harder than anyone here at this agency." And I like that. And I think you're going to set the bar for what people can and can't get away with here. And
Yeah.
whether you have talent, if you're, as I was, a little immature and uncouth, it's just like, we'll work with that. And we could work with that drive. People could see that in you.
Yeah, I like that you mentioned work ethic because so often we hear stories like that and we think, Chris, wow, just what a guy must have amazing skills, which is true. But work ethic, I find when you dig deeper in any story, this idea, this myth that there are people out there who are just um, lazily dancing their way to extreme success in any field. It's such a myth. It's like you talk to anyone and who's really successful in what they do, and so often you just find, just hard work and working harder than anyone else is like it's one of those things that you can't beat over the long term, right? Like over the long term,
Yeah.
if you'll do that with a teachable attitude and um I feel like that combination is pretty unstoppable in most fields.
Yeah, and I have to confess something here. When I was going to art center, it was filled with upper class and just, how do I say this, wealthy students, or students from very wealthy backgrounds. So I never felt like I totally fit in, even at art school, where this is supposed to be my tribe. People are driving in fancy cars. I'm driving in a third generation hand me down car, barely holding together, right? It's like, you ever watch romantic comedy when the guy's trying to impress the girl and drives up to pick her up for a date, and the screeching sound of the timing belt hits right at the most inappropriate time, so everybody's looking at him awkwardly. That was no
Yes.
joke. That was my life. That was the car I was driving. And so I always thought, my goodness, these people have traveled the world. They've
Yeah.
experienced cultures and architecture and art. They've gone to galleries and they've done things. I haven't done anything. But the one thing that kind of allowed me to sleep well at night was knowing this thing: I will outwork them. And that's what I would just build my own identity on. And I would just say, you know what, when you're out partying, chilling, drinking wine and cheese, whatever you guys wind up doing, I'll be in the library and I'll
Mm,
be in the computer lab. This is what I will do. And that
yeah.
work ethic is the thing that whenever I started to doubt myself, I would just lean in. You know what? Let's work and let's get to
Yeah.
work.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's I'm just laughing because the timing belt thing
You know what I'm talking
that
about then.
I do. Yeah, anyone who's ever driven one of the older cars, like I had a Hyundai Excel like 1991, 92, and it would, yeah, when there's something so just embarrassing about how loud it is when that if your timing belt would make that noise when you're trying to take off from somewhere and make a good impression on people, and
Yeah.
then you hear this massively like It's anyone, if anyone's ever experienced that, that's why I'm chuckling, because I've been there, and it's so like, oh man, just hide your face in shame, the loudest, most embarrassing noise. So I love that you said that. Oh,
And
that's
it's
so
not like I
good.
didn't try to take care of it. I would take it to the mechanic. They're like, yeah, it's just loose sometimes. And
That's
most of
right.
the times it
Yeah.
would just be fine. But it's
Yeah.
right when, somebody you're trying to impress, a pretty girl or a teacher, and it's a it's that
Yeah.
sounds going like, oh, they can hear
And
you
so
coming.
loud. Oh, that's why
Yeah.
it's bringing back memories. I had someone just the other day on the podcast talk about. He was telling stories about how amazing his mum is, and just saying that when he was 16, he he's like, I don't know. I mean, his mum let him take this girl out on a date, and they must have been able to get their license at 16 where he was. So he took their car. And to impress this girl, he sort of pulled out of the driveway really fast and took off, lost control of the car, not at a fast speed, but just hit the curb and broke the axle, so basically
Oh,
100 meters away from home. So he he had to walk his date back to their house. And the story was about how his mum was so just like, she made him pay her back and everything for it, but she was unperturbed, was more worried about him, and went and got the car and thought it was hilarious how it was, but still made him pay it back in this mix of fun. Like, how do you not take yourself too seriously, but also, like I said, she still made him pay her back. But that was another great story that just popped into my head about terrible dating dating stories involving cars. That's so good. So, Chris, what about mentors? In your across your career so far, who have been some of the people that you've watched from afar or worked closely with, who have been the biggest inspirations and influences on your leadership and entrepreneurship?
I've been very lucky to have just at the right time in my life someone who saw something in me or who took a chance and helped me to get over a rough patch. There are too many teachers in my life to name, but there are two very specific people who are probably the most instrumental. I should say three. First is the most obvious one is my dad, and my dad, being the oldest male of I think 11 brothers and sisters, he had a very different way of raising us than any of my uncles and aunts. He would whenever I got in trouble, and I would get in trouble from time to time. The old way of dealing with that was to just whip you, right? So corporal punishment. But my dad never did any of that. He
Mm,
sat us down and we would talk for an hour and a half, and he would lecture us and he would ask questions. And later on, I just found out that there's a term for that. It's called the Socratic approach. He would ask me questions to make me think about my logic and have me reason things with him so that I would arrive at the same conclusion. Now, when I was a kid, this was torturous. I would rather just get the belt and get it over with so I can go back to playing video games or go play hide and seek with my friends. But,
yeah.
sitting there with my dad for an hour and a half, like, Dad, I got it. I got it. He goes, No, we're going to keep talking about this. So my dad is a person who's taught me a lot of things, not directly, but just indirectly. I learned this from him. The next person is, I mentioned before, my business coach, Kier McLaren, who I worked with for over 10 years. And we would meet every single week for an hour, sometimes 2 hours, for over 10 years without fail. Like barring somebody's holiday or anything big, we would meet. And he basically taught me everything that I know about business today. Basic things like saying what you think. Like I always thought like we were supposed to dance around the circle and be very polite. But if I wanted to know what the budget was, I should just ask the client, is this the budget? And if you're considering other people, will you tell us that you're considering other people? And so that was a lot about how I learned how to do business and do sales and negotiations
Mm,
with the clients. The third person
yeah.
is my friend from school. His name is Jose Caballé, and he's a Puerto Rican American. And he and I reconnect after 10 years of doing different things. And he taught me so much about running an education company, authoring a product. And he's the guy who got me to be on camera. And that was in January of 2014. He had said, let's go make some videos for YouTube. And I thought that was the dumbest, craziest idea ever, especially because I was still battling with my introversion. But the decision to do so obviously has a profound impact on my life, changed the course of my life and my business.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing about those three. Are there any? Let's go through each of them and just see.
Okay.
With your dad, are there any stories that are imprinted in your brain about particular lectures he gave you, or something completely different just about your dad, where he
Yeah,
handled
there are.
life? Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Sorry, you cut out there, so I thought maybe you had finished, but okay. Yeah, for my dad, I mean, there's a lot of little things. Like I'll tell you a little story, tiny little story. I was in grade school, and one of my friends had a handheld gaming device. Back then, they were just blinking lights that you pretended was a football player, and you would just move this around. And so one of my friends from school that I didn't even know that well would loan it to me. I'd come home, I'd play it. My dad would look at me like, "What is that?" I said, "Oh, my friend loaned it to me." He goes, I don't know." And then sure enough, the handheld breaks and it just doesn't work anymore. And my dad being the engineer and we call him Mr. Fix It, I said, "Dad, I don't know what's wrong. I don't know why it's not working." He said, "So here's the problem. Here's one reason why we don't want to borrow things that we don't need that aren't ours, because now when we borrow those things, we become responsible for them. Now, it could just been that it was ready to break or you actually did something to break it, but now you might have to buy it and replace it, so you'll be out the money and you won't even have the game console." I was like, "Oh shoot, okay, I have to think about this." Luckily though, my dad was able to open it, he checked it out, saw there's something back in. There was one loose wire, and thank God he is who he is. So whew, that taught me this powerful lesson. Like, you know what? Be good with what you have. Don't be looking around everywhere and saying, "Oh, I want those things," and covet things that you don't really need, because you become
Yeah.
responsible for them.
Yeah, that's such a good lesson. Your dad sounds like an amazing person and a great role model. What about your business coach? Any stories of wisdom or advice? You already mentioned about that great advice around um, going in the room to to welcome clients. But any other stories that really are ingrained in your memory from your business coach giving you advice or
Yeah,
watching
if
how
this
they handled something?
yeah, this podcast for 7 hours, I wouldn't even have enough time to tell you all the things I learned from him. But I'll pick out one where I think he set me straight on a couple of different things. Now, oftentimes as Kira and I would get together, I would sit there and think about like, okay, so for this week I want to talk about X, right? And so sure enough, we get together. I said, "Hey, Kira, this employee is just making me insane. Like I'm just making me really angry by behaving this way." And he would let me talk, and I could see his expression was and then it would just switch over to a little smirk. And he waits for me to finish. I finish, and he says, "So this employee made you angry?" I could sense something was coming. I'm like, "Yes." He's like, "An employee can make you do something." Well, let me ask you this question: who hired this person? Like me. And who hasn't fired this person? Well, that's me. Who allows this behavior to continue? Well, that's me. He goes, "So you could do something about it, or you could stop complaining." Because he said, in life, there are no victims, just volunteers. And so if you don't want people to come in late, you should set the policy, and then you have to enforce the policy. These are two important things. So make
Mm.
a decision.
That's so good. I love that. I can just imagine the sitting there nodding. Yeah, so it made you feel angry, hey? That's great.
Right.
What about the third person, your friend who really inspired or really got you started with say YouTube and making content? Any stories from that relationship from your friend about sort of pivotal moments or funny stories or anything that really stands out as a story with him?
Yeah. This next story has a title for it. It's called The Corridor. So Jose and I were both invited to speak in Seattle, and he's an extrovert. He's a self-described loud and obnoxious Puerto Rican, and he could be comfortable in a room full of strangers and no problems. I'm the exact opposite. So Jose and I were giving a presentation, and we had practiced the night before, but there's only so much we can practice together. And so we're going to be up in about 30 minutes. So we're in the hallway, the corridor between the stage and somewhere else, and we're just going over lines and like who's going to say what. It's important that we have some flow, some chemistry together. And he's kind of just sitting there chilling, and I'm pacing back and forth very nervously in the corridor. He goes, "What are you doing?" said, "Oh, dude, I'm so nervous." And he goes, "Well, you're making me nervous by pacing like this. Hey, Chris, come over here. I want to show you something." So I'm like, "What?" He goes, "I want you to look through that doorway." So he pulls the door ajar and he's like, "Tell me what you see out there." And so from our vantage point, we could see the everyone in attendance looking at whoever's speaking, but they can't see us. I said, "I don't get it. I see a bunch of people." He goes, "Well, no, look again. Look a little deeper." I'm like, "Dude, what is your point? I'm nervous enough as it is." He goes, "Everybody out there is is white. We're in Portland. Okay. It's pretty white as it comes." He goes, "You're Vietnamese. I'm Puerto Rican." And he goes, "All we have to do is go out there and be ourselves, and we could suck. We could just forget everything we're going to say. But because we are who we are, we're going to be so different, and we're going to speak from a different place, and we're going to have a different style that they won't help but be able to like us just because we're so different, that we're unique." And he taught me a really valuable lesson that day, is that all my life I've been running away from who I was, trying to blend in, trying to be socially accepted. And that was the beginning. It wasn't transformative in that moment, but it's the beginning of me finding my own voice, leaning into my culture, and bringing all of what I have when I'm in a room with people.
Yeah, that's wonderful advice. And just, yeah, great stories. Thank you for sharing all of those stories with us. I'm interested to know for you as a leader, as a businessman, as a content creator, as a designer, all the different things you do, Chris. Are there any particular aha moments for you in the past few years that stand out where you learnt a lesson? I know you've probably already mentioned a couple here, but any other sort of big aha moments for you as Chris, the entrepreneur, businessman, leader that come to mind?
There's probably a moment or two. I'm trying to sort through like which one would be the most relevant, right? So
Sure.
as an aha moment. Okay. I remember one here I can share with you. Um, One of the things that my business coach got me to do was to do public speaking. It was basically building upon, okay, now you can talk to your clients, now go out into the world and stop being the world's best kept secret. You have things to share, and I'm sure people want to hear about the stories that you've experienced in your life. And so I remember, like, okay, I'll do this. And I would volunteer for one local event and another. And I just remember, like, oh, so fear, anxiety inducing. I would lose sleep. Somebody told this joke. This didn't really happen to me, but basically, on the day that this person agreed to do public speaking, they would just start losing weight, and it's just restless, sleepless nights, And that was me going through like, oh, what am I to say, and just grinding away at the presentation.
Mm.
But I remember one time I was in Seattle. I was doing a talk for an Adobe related event, and I think I was the last speaker of that day. And I went out and I spoke, and I felt like I nailed the landing, and I wasn't nervous. And I remember, like, as soon as I was finished, people would applaud, and I kind of left the stage, and I called my wife immediately. I was just like, I got to call my wife. And she was like, "Honey, is everything okay? You never call me. Is everything okay?" So you won't believe it. It's the first time I've spoken, I guess, in a year or 2 years that I haven't been just scared out of my wits. And she goes, "What's different?" I said, "I don't know." But I started to think about it,
Mm.
right? I started to think about it. And the thing that was different is prior to this point in time, I had all these ideas about who I was and who I was supposed to be on stage. And I thought, I want to do a really good job. I want to impress people. I want to sound eloquent and intelligent. I want to give these valuable things. But the funny thing was, about a week and a half before I went to do this talk, my wife was watching a YouTube video, and there was like a monk, and he was speaking to a group of people. I think he must have been like a Tibetan monk or something like that. And he was speaking to some people, and he says, a lot of people are afraid to do public speaking. Do you want to know why I'm not afraid? And he said the reason why he wasn't afraid was because he was saying a blessing to each person. He was wishing them and sending positive thoughts. And I was like, this is so intriguing. So if we take our ego out of it, if we stop trying to live up to some impossible perfect standard that we'll never measure up to, and feeling the gap between where we are and that impossible perfect standard. If we just surrender, say, you know what, I'm just going to be on stage. I'm going to think about giving value to people, and hopefully for the person who's thinking about quitting, to give them a reason to stay in the business. For a person who's struggling, give them a tool so that they don't have to experience as much pain. If I just tried to wish things for people, like wish them well, to send
Mm,
a blessing, to give them some kind of gift in the way that I can, that was the big breakthrough.
yeah.
And that was monumental for me. And now I try, whenever I get those nerves backstage, I keep sitting there thinking, someone out there needs help. Do your best just to help them. Forget about if you nail the landing. Forget about all that. And it turns
Yeah.
out, when you stop thinking like that, you are fully present, and your words will come out and you'll flow. It's a beautiful thing when
Mm,
that happens.
that's so good. It's such great advice, and it's such a powerful mindset shift if you can just change from thinking about getting it right or making it perfect to actually just trying to help someone, um, and share something that's going to help someone out there. And that's yeah, that's I think that's also a good lesson. Like it applies in a different way, but it's also a good lesson for business and for um, I love one of my favorite books on consulting is a book by Patrick Lencioni, who I'm a big fan of everything he does, to be honest. But it's called, it's got a really funny name. It's called Getting Naked. And it's about consulting in a way that is really transparent and without any agenda. And the big idea that he talks about, it's a bit like what you just shared. It's like when you sit down with a client or with a prospect, instead of having some like sort of strategy to how am I going to get this to happen or that to happen. It's like you still have that, but the big idea is just get in there and start helping them. Like if you just approach anyone that comes on your radar and try to be helpful and try to just do something that's going to really add value for them. And with consulting, it's often just get in there and just, if there's anything you can do that's going to really add value to that person, your chances of like your relationship, your rapport you build, your like the sort of people you end up working with and their how they think about price, if you can just get in there and really help people, that is such like it has all of these added benefits like a flow on effects, and so it's like the business version of that advice for public speaking.
Yeah. I agree with that, by the way, too. When you're doing sales or you're doing consulting, to let go of whatever you think, let go of this script, let go of the
Mm,
framework, and just have a conversation with someone and really try to be there for them,
yeah.
to really listen.
It's funny, isn't it? It's so rare. It shouldn't be. Well, I don't know if it shouldn't be, but I wish it wasn't so rare. But when you sit down, when you're on the other side of that and you go, this person really cares and is trying to help me and is fully present, that's a differentiator. And everyone's always looking for differentiation. But if you're in any sort of role where there's a service, like, where who someone's dealing with matters, if you can be that person who's present and really cares and is just trying to be there for them, that is a great place to start. That beats almost anything else you can say or do in that scenario, in my opinion.
Yeah. And they can feel it.
Oh yeah, 100%. Even if it's over the phone, or I agree. If you can, and I'm also a big believer. I was gonna jump into something else, but just to add to this thought, I think giving away, like not being afraid to give away IP as well. I think that's a big challenge for a lot of leaders around content creation. I sort of tend to believe, you know what, just get in, just get out there and help people wherever and whenever you can. And if you're the thought leader that people go, that's where I go to get help for X, Y, or Z, then the money will come. There's a way to make that flow. But if you can just get out there or in a conversation, I try to really, every now and then you have the thought when you're chatting with someone, oh, but if I tell them this, they may not need me for that. And I believe, you know what, just tell them, just share it, help them. Sometimes in my line of work, that's about going, you know what, you could get me to come in and run that, or you could probably do it yourself and it would be just as good for this particular
Right.
type of thing. And I feel like when you do that and do the right thing by people and really try to Yeah, just even take a hit for them as well, and just put them before you in that moment. It always comes back. It always pays off. Maybe not with that person, but when you have that approach, I think it's just such a good way to do business.
I agree.
Well, let's jump into Leadership Express. I've got a couple of questions as we draw to a close, Chris. The
Okay.
first question I want to ask you is, what's a book that you've gifted to other people or recommended a lot to other people?
Okay. You just want one book?
You
Because I
can give
recommend a lot
me
of books.
you can give me as many as you can think of.
Okay. The first book that I'll recommend to people is The Win Without Pitching Manifesto, written by Blair Enns. And it's a very simple book. It's written in 12 proclamations. It's a manifesto, so it's like very tight on words, and I think value to word count very, very high, expertly written. And it's a sneaky book on positioning and expertise and position yourself as an expert. The next book I'll recommend is The Coaching Habit, written by Michael Bungay Stanier. And it's a wonderful book. And it's for people who don't even want to be coaches. It's really about leadership management and how to use questions to drive conversation. Because Michael in the book emphasizes if we can stay curious a little bit longer, to ask a few more questions and be slower to give advice, will help people to become more self-reliant, self-confident, and will empower them to figure out their own genius. So it's a really beautiful book. Another book that I truly, truly recommend is this book called Pop, written by Sam Horn. And it's a book about how to say and phrase things in ways that people can remember them. So taking cliches and
Mm.
transforming them. She has like a really helpful tools on what you can do to combine things that you've heard before to make them truly unique and different, and to create your own intellectual property.
Wow, that is a brilliant little list. I think there's a couple on there that I'm going to go and check out. Pop is one of them. I've heard of the Coaching Habit, and the what was the what manifesto? Sorry, was the first
The
recommendation?
Win Without Pitching
The
Manifesto
Win
by
Without
Blair
Pitching
Enns.
manifesto. I've definitely come
Mhm.
across that before. I may have even read it because it's not a long read.
It's a very short read.
It's a very
My
short
friend
read. Yeah.
Jose, yeah, he would joke, it's like a two poop book. Like you can read it if you, like during two bowel movements.
Yeah, that's great. I like that. I like that metric for how long a book is. That's good.
Yeah.
Great recommendations. What about right now? Are there any? What are you loving listening to, reading, watching? Are there any books, blogs, podcasts, shows that you're watching or reading, listening to?
Yes. My very favorite podcast of all time, I think, is Radiolab. And Radiolab takes a look at interesting phenomenon, culture, and stories through the lens of a little bit of science. It's highly entertaining, very well produced, great storytelling, and they cover a wide range of subjects from things like the placebo effect to like, do animals have a soul and a spirit? And it's really fascinating stuff, and I enjoy it as every time I walk, every time I have a minute to myself, I'm listening to Radiolab. And another podcast, which I'm going to also turn into a book recommendation, another
Yeah.
podcast I like is the Moth Radio Hour. And it's really
Mm.
about storytelling. They have things called story slams and the story grand slam. And so their whole mission is to help find and surface stories. And they just recently dropped a book that came out a couple of weeks ago, and it's called, unsurprisingly, How to Tell This Story. And it's really beautiful because it has snippets from some of the best talks that they've ever had the ability to share with people, but through three editors, because it's not written by one person. There's a lot of really great helpful tips. And one thing they share, and I'll share it, what I've been
Yeah.
picking up is, whenever you tell a story, there have to be stakes. We have to know what's at risk, what's the pain and
Mm.
the gain, right? So when you tell a story, you need to let the audience know that this is uh, what happens if things don't work out for you. And when you do that and you tell a truth, honest and personal story, and you're brave enough to be vulnerable. I think there's a psychologist. His name is Yuri Hansen or Hassan,
Mm.
and he talks about how the mind of the storyteller and the listener, uh, different or the same parts of their brains fire off when they're immersed in your story. It's
Mm.
a wonderful phenomenon. I think it's called like speaker audience neural coupling or something like that. So
Yeah.
it's fascinating when you pull people into your story. So if you want to connect with people, learn how to tell a better story.
That's amazing. I always talk about I like my wife Liz has to put up with my commentating whenever we're watching anything, particularly if it's something that I think is um, poorly made or something. I catch myself. I only catch myself when Liz is glaring at me. I'm like, I'm so sorry. I commentate on things we're watching so much, but I'm always commentating on the tension, right? Like in
Yep.
stories, I'm always saying, you'll be watching a great show, and then they will kill off a character, or famously, in any of these sort of famous sitcoms, the couple nearly gets together, but then they break them up again. And I'm always talking about tension, but I've never thought about it like that, about what's at stake. And that's such a great filter. Automatically, you get into the why and the so what and the all the other. That's probably
100%.
the best filter I've ever heard, and I'm obsessed with storytelling. So that in and of itself was worth the podcast, Chris. Anyone listening, think about that and tell stories by thinking of what's at stake and communicate that to people. Boom, that is a game changer.
I'm glad you like that. I mean, I've been teaching sequential design and storyboarding for quite some time,
Hmm.
and there's many different approaches to it. But I once I read that phrase, because I've been thinking about like people tell
Yeah.
you it's storytelling is about creating and releasing tension, but then
Yes.
you're like, well, what is tension then?
Yeah.
So then,
Yeah.
but what is conflict? Robert
Yeah.
McKee says, no conflict, no story. So I'm like, how do we manufacture conflict? Well, since they're really about helping you to unearth your own story, they don't have these tools available that fiction writers have,
Yes.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So find out what's at stake and why it matters to you and why it should matter to the audience and why are you telling a story? And then they talk about the transformation, which is very important in all stories. Is how
Yes.
are you different today? How
Hmm.
did you change? How did these events impact your life and created something that you can't unsee or unknow?
Hmm. Which is different to in another. I really love Russell Brunson from ClickFunnels, and I
Hmm.
really enjoy some of his work around marketing. I think um, some of his sort of work around Epiphany, his what he calls the Epiphany Bridge story, is similar. But I found the same challenge with Epiphany. He does talk about achievement and transformation, and I love that. And it's not his idea. Some of that comes from the hero with a
Right.
thousand faces, and but yeah, that idea of that was big for me. Going, okay, how do you articulate achievement and then go a step further and articulate transformation? Because every wonderful great story doesn't stop at achievement, what they did. It actually goes to another level with who they became, or what they were part of transforming around them as well.
Yeah. And the thing that's really beautiful about the Moth Radio Hour in this book, How to Tell a Story, is that not all the stories have a happy ending. Some of them are
Mm,
actually quite tragic, and you listen to the story, you'll read it, and it'll bring tears to your eyes.
yeah.
And so they say that if you know what's at stake, then you know that a decision has to be made. There's always that proverbial fork in the road. And
Mm,
sometimes we focus on the action, the positive decisions, but sometimes inaction or not making a decision is a decision. And there's a story in there about a relationship with a young woman and her grandmother, and the young woman got pregnant. It was a kind of a big deal, and she didn't think she could raise a child, so she gave the child up for adoption, which was a very sore point for the family. And throughout the years, she had quietly stalked her estranged daughter to see if she was doing okay, and she had all these dark thoughts, and she's telling a story, and the thoughts were like, was she better off without me, and did she find a better home, or is she doing worse? And she was pleasantly surprised that her daughter was doing really well in life, and she didn't know how to tell her grandmother this, and she kept like looking and waiting for an opportunity to tell it to her, knowing how painful that giving her up for adoption was for the family. And so her grandmother has a stroke, and she decides, okay, today's the day I'm going to tell her. I have to tell her. She's getting kind of old. So she goes and she tells her. She goes, "You remember how I had to give up my daughter for adoption?" And the grandmother looks at her and is like, "No." And she says, "Literally, she died the next day." And it was a heartbreaking thing because she had all this stuff that she could have shared and they could have grown through the experience, but she didn't have the courage to tell her. And that was a story about not
Mm.
taking action.
Mm.
Profound, you know,
Yeah,
but
that is
it's there's
profound.
not a happy ending on that one.
Yeah, I mean yeah, that's so profound. Wow. It reminds me of people, I can't remember where, there's so many different sources out there, but talking to people on their deathbeds and how often it is what they didn't do. I think people have mentioned this in the podcast actually, that's really inspired them. That usually it's what they didn't do rather than what they
Right.
did do that they regret. It's very often I wish I had of done that, or
Right.
tried that, or reconnected with them, or whatever it is. It's so often it's a omission that people regret rather than what they actually did.
Yeah, it's almost always you regret what you didn't do versus what you did do.
Mm. Well, we could, like you said, we could go probably 7,000 hours talking about all the different stories in your life. And this has been so much fun. Let me ask you one more question just to land, Chris. If you could only give one piece of leadership advice to a young leader, what would you say to them?
The one piece of advice I would give people is start making content today. I waited until I was 42 years old before I made my first YouTube video. And the 8 years since then, it's been a profound transformative change in my life. And I am reaping the benefits of making that one bold, courageous decision way back then. And I can't tell you how different my life is today from prior to that. So, just for context, I started my company in
Mm.
1995. It was
Hmm.
called Blind, and we had made commercials and music videos. So, I was in the music video and commercial making business for 20 plus years. Since starting on this journey on making content, I
Mm.
now no longer do client work, and we've been client free since December of 2018. So that means I get to do what I want, when I want, with who I want, for as long as I want. And it's a beautiful, just this harmonious, virtuous cycle that I live in right now. So I'm so happy that I wish it for more people.
Yeah. I love that advice. I haven't had that before as the one piece of advice, but I second it. Um, it's oh, you know what? I've mentioned this before on the podcast, but this is what I love about creating content and just going out there and doing it. And when I started this podcast, I had a week. In terms of finding the right way to create content that works for you. But the point is, there's no question about whether you do it. You just need to find the right way to do it. And for me, this podcast has been wonderful because I love being able to ask the questions and be really interested in people's lives, but also it creates wonderful leadership content for people, and it's based around people's stories. And there was a week recently where I realized, wait a second, this week I had quite a few podcasts on that one week. I realized, wow, okay, I probably had 10 that week, which was a lot. And I created 10 hours of content. And that was probably more than I created last year. And I did that in a
Mm.
week. And that for me was I thought that was hilarious. And and yet there are so many people out there that's why I just want to echo what you said, who are umming and ahhing and go and add up how much content you created last year, particularly um video and engaging content, and often it'll be less than an hour that people create because we get so perfectionistic about it. And it's like, well, actually the best way to work out what works is to go and do it and try it and watch and learn. And but I love what Gary Vaynerchuk says, that like, what your content will be subjective. This is paraphrasing, but he's like, your content, the quality of your content, yeah, that'll be subjective. What's not subjective is that you have to go out there and start creating content.
Mm.
Well, Chris, for those who have just loved hearing some of your story, where can they find you and your organizations online?
I try to make it very easy to find me. If you go to thefutur.com, you can find almost all of our resources there, and the future spelled without an E. So it's FUTUR, no E at the end. And you can find me on most social platforms at the Chris Doe, and Doe is spelled DO.
Wonderful. Well, thank you to our listeners for tuning in. What an episode. This is going to be one of the favorites, I can already tell. Just jam packed with epic stories and what's at stake. Just some of these ideas that seriously I need to go and write them down or listen again. It's been so good. Don't forget, I also have the John O'White Leadership Podcast and the Leadership Question of the Day podcast, where you can go to continue to invest in your leadership. But I want to finish today by saying a massive thank you to you, Chris, for being so generous with your time, for telling such great stories. And I think a lot of people are going to be really helped by what you shared today. So thank you so much for spending time with me.
Thank you. It was my pleasure.
Well, I hope you enjoyed that episode of the Leadership Conversations podcast as much as I did. If you're joining us for the first time, don't forget to check out consultclarity.org. That's our website, consultclarity.org. We have so many free resources on there, including our 7 Questions on Leadership series. We've had more than 1,500 leaders from all over the world in all different roles, in different industries, answer these 7 questions on leadership, and leaders give these in-depth answers around how they spend their time, a book that's been significant for them. It's just a gold mine. It's completely free to access, so go to consultclarity.org and look for that. We'd also love to interview you about your leadership. I believe your experience, your life, your context means that you have advice on leadership that other leaders can learn from. Yes, you. If you're going, not me, well, no, I really believe you would have something to add. So if you're looking for a way to give back, it's completely free to get involved. And we would love to interview you through the 7 Questions on Leadership. You just go to consultclarity.org/7-questions-interest, or Google consultclarity.org 7 questions interest and fill out the form and get involved. We have a free resource on our website called the Leadership Survival Guide. It's a 57-page ebook, 10 world-class leaders giving their thoughts on leadership, and that's completely free. It's available on our homepage, consultclarity.org, right at the top, so make sure you go and get that and download it today. And we have a free daily email that you can subscribe to. We send this out to over 15,000 leaders from around the world. And it contains the highlights of content from our podcasts, our blogs, our books we're reading. It's got the best content, and it gives you exclusive, limited, early access to our masterclasses, workshops, new products, special offers. It's all for our subscribers. You can go to consultclarity.org/subscribe and join 15,000 other leaders. And my gift to you is to work really hard, particularly through the Leadership Conversations podcast. I have been blown away by the quality of the leaders, and I'm learning as much as anyone in doing these interviews. So I'm having a great time. And my gift to you is to keep lining up the best leaders I can to invest in your leadership. Your gift to me, if you're finding this helpful, there is something that you could do that would help us out massively. And that is to write a review and to leave a rating for our podcast or wherever you're watching or listening to this. I can't tell you how much that helps us out. Also, subscribe or follow. It really does make a difference in helping us to help more leaders become everything they're meant to be. Another thing that means a lot to me personally is when I see our community share our content. So if you do share this or any other piece of content on social media, then thank you, and please do that. And look for me, John O'White, or Clarity, and tag us in your post. Our team is always looking for posts to engage with from our community, and there's also a chance that we'll share your content to go beyond and share it with our followers. Last of all, you can check out my book. It's called Step Up or Step Out: How to Deal with Difficult People Even If You Hate Conflict. I wrote this book because 50% of the coaching sessions I have with leaders, this topic comes up again and again and again. And it's this idea of, how do I have this difficult conversation? How do I lead this person better when I'm finding them difficult? Or in some cases, you look and you say, I think I might be leading a difficult person. They're just quite difficult to lead, or I'm finding them quite difficult to lead. So there's a 3-step process that I unpack in Step Up or Step Out. And the amazing thing, and I've literally done this myself, and I've heard it anecdotally from other leaders as I've coached them, is that if you follow this process, you will see that person step up and change their behavior or make a decision, which is to step out some of the time. 95% of the time, people will step up or step out in just 4 weeks. And I stand by that. It's you have to read the book to understand, but I really do believe in it, and I've experienced it firsthand. It works. So you can go to Amazon, look up Step Up or Step Out John O. White, or store.consultclarity.org/book. Well, thank you so much for listening. We're going to be back with a new episode next time of the Leadership Conversations podcast. And I hope today has helped you to take another step towards becoming the leader you're meant to be. See you next time.